In March 1871, Congress appropriated $40,000 for an expedition to the little-known western region of Yellowstone to be led by Dr. Ferdinand Hayden. Hayden was the director of the U.S. Geological Survey. He invited painter Thomas Moran at the behest of robber baron J. Cook to document the expedition, along with photographer William Henry Jackson. Moran had emigrated from England to New York and become chief illustrator for Scribner's Monthly magazine. On July 21, 1871, the expedition entered the region at the Gardiner River, and they made their way upriver to what is known today as Mammoth Hot Springs. Over a span of 40 days, Moran documented over 30 locations. His watercolors, which were published in Scribner's, captured the imagination of the American public. They were also purposefully displayed around the rotunda of our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., to encourage Congress to enact legislation to establish Yellowstone as our nation's first national park. President Ulysses S. Grant signed that legislation into law, establishing Yellowstone as our nation's first national park on March 1, 1872, but with appreciation, not necessarily conservation, in mind. In the same year, 1872, Civil War veteran Edward Kemys distinguished himself by modeling and installing the first public American wildlife sculpture to be installed in the United States. Two Hudson Bay gray wolves quarreling over the carcass of a deer was cast in life-size in bronze and installed in Philadelphia's Fairmount Park. With it, Kemys added sculpture as a format, depth as a dimension, and bronze as a medium to American wildlife art, and he loosened the grip that realism had formerly had on the genre. Kemys also diversified the ideology in art because he celebrated the wildness of wolves as predators over 30 years before Jack London had written and published Call of the Wild. Instead of positioning his wolves as predators that should be feared and eradicated, Kemys celebrated them, though his point of view was not particularly prevalent. Just 3 years before, in the state of New York, legislators had passed legislation offering bounties to anyone who wanted to hunt and eliminate wolves altogether, because they perceived wolves to be a threat to farmers as well as society. Karl Rangius, a German immigrant who, like Thomas Moran, had come to the U.S. seeking opportunity, was discovered by William Hornaday, the first director of the New York Zoological Society. Hornaday introduced the artist to George B. Grinnell, a fellow member of the Boone and Crockett Hunting Club. Grinnell, whose epitaph would one day be father of the conservation movement, was the publisher of Forest and Stream, a weekly journal of the rod and gun, and he used that magazine to espouse conservation ethics and laws to protect fish and game. Pronghorn Antelope was the first work by Rangius that Grinnell published. This led to more commissions for Forest and Stream and other magazines, which played an important role in the birth of the conservation movement. Rangius consequently established himself as a noteworthy painter and a sportsman who appreciated hunting as a means to build character through independence and self-reliance. The duck stamp, or U.S. migratory bird hunting stamp as it's colloquially known, was established in 1934 at the recommendation of a presidential commission chaired by J.N. Ding Darling, a Pulitzer Prize-winning political cartoonist from Des Moines, Iowa. The stamp was a form of tax, actually, imposed on hunters to fund game management, which Aldo Leopold, who authored a book of the same title, defined as the art of making the land produce sustained annual crops of wildlife for recreational use. In its first 50 years, the duck stamp program resulted in the acquisition of over 4 million acres of wetlands, expanded habitat management, and law enforcement. The first federal duck stamp was actually drawn by Ding Darling himself of two mallards. On March 24, 1989, the Valdez, an oil tanker owned by the Exxon Corporation, ran aground on Bly Reef after departing and having filled up with crude oil from the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Terminal. As much as 38 million gallons leaked into Prince William Sound and eventually impacted some 1,300 miles of shoreline and 11,000 square miles of ocean. As satellites broadcast images of wildlife dead and dying in the oil slick, Swedish-American sculptor Kent Ullberg, who had just created a monument honoring conservation for the National Wildlife Federation headquarters in Washington, D.C., was moved through grief to model a somber portrait in clay of a lifeless eagle, which he completed in a matter of days. When Mozart's Requiem was aired on the public radio station that he was listening to in his studio while he was working, a title occurred to Ullberg that captured the pathos of the moment. It was Requiem for Prince William Sound. Sculptor Leo Osborne, who lived in Maine at the time, took another approach. Caulking gun in hand, he angrily defaced an exquisite maple burlwood carving of shorebirds during their annual springtime mating ritual, destroying the beauty and the very essence of his art. For Osborne, this destructive act was a personal happening, similar to the happening staged in the 1960s when that form of artistic expression was all the rage. The title proved to be prophetic 20 years later. He titled the sculpture the same as his poem that accompanied it, Still Not Listening. 20 years later, when the BP Deepwater Horizon oil Gulf spill eclipsed the Exxon Valdez spill to become the largest marine spill in the history of the world at 5 million barrels, not gallons, but barrels, Osborne's poem and sculpture became all the more poignant. In 1989, the same year, Walter Ferguson, a New York-born and American-trained artist who had relocated his family in 1965 to Israel, created this environmental activist painting entitled Save the World. He followed it up in 1992 with Apocalypse, picturing refineries in the middle ground near the industrial city of Haifa and the polluted Alexander River just north of Bet Yaneh on the Mediterranean, just north of where he and his family lived, and in fact where they used to fish, that is, before paper industry chemical pollution killed off the river. As if that were not enough for 1 year, 1989 was punctuated when the U.S. Congress released a report prepared by members of the U.S. Forest Service, BLM, and Fish and Wildlife over a 6-month period, which estimated that approximately only 2,500 pairs of northern spotted owls remain in the Pacific Northwest. At the same time, organizations such as Earthwatch and Sierra Club estimated that at the prevailing rate of logging, old-growth forests would be decimated altogether within a matter of decades. To protect the owl, and therefore old-growth forests in the Northwest, the Department of Interior was encouraged to list the species under the 1969 Endangered Species Act, which had the potential to shut down logging by bestowing special status on the owl. In this context, Canadian painter Robert Bateman created Carmanah Contrast, pictured here, the first in what he called his environmental series. It had grown out of a collective effort by artists who gathered on Vancouver Island in 1989 to create awareness and resistance against clear-cutting of an old-growth forest known as Carmanah. Carmanah Contrasts consist of contrasting images in contrasting fields of color layered in meaning. The lower field is comprised of a gray and sterile picture littered with hardened stumps, clear-cut debris devoid of life. The upper field, which comprises about a third of the canvas, is painted in hues of greens and contains lush forest imagery. Ideologically, Carmanah Contrast is a condemnation of unethical industrial forestry. Aesthetically, Carmanah Contrast is a pre-postmodern statement by a visionary artist willing to take artistic risks that foreshadow the next big movement in art. Bateman followed this up in 1989 with Mossy Branches' Spotted Owl, a painting of the reclusive bird at the center of the battle where logging threatened old-growth forests and where pending legal status threatened livelihoods and a way of life for thousands of loggers and their families. To convey the interdependence of the owl and its habitat, Bateman centered and backlit the owl with raking sunlight and used this compositional device to set off the rich mosses, which, like the owl itself, rely on the ecology of the old-growth forest for sustenance. The northern spotted owl was subsequently listed as a threatened species on July 23, 1990. Bateman followed this up and continued his environmental foray with other brave and powerful paintings, notably in 1993, Driftnet, which exposes the grim realities of industrial-scale commercial fishing. For maximum impact, Bateman overlaid the painting with actual non-biodegradable fishing netting that could entangle, cut, and kill unintended victims with ease. New York artist Lisa Lebofsky has dedicated a sizable portion of her young career to painting glaciers, melting ice, and rising seas. This began in 2010 when she was invited by her father, a retired science teacher, to join him along with other science educators to sail from Argentina to Antarctica. In 2012, pastel artist Zaria Foreman reached out to Lebofsky to join an expedition in collaboration with the New Bedford Whaling Museum to retrace the journey of the Hudson River painter William Bradford along the northwest coast of Greenland. Surmer Mute, painted in oil on aluminum and measuring 40 by 64 inches, is pictured here from that particular expedition. In 2014, Lebofsky and Foreman traveled to the Maldives, an island nation with an average elevation of about 5 feet above sea level, making it the most susceptible nation on Earth to the impact of rising seas from global warming and melting ice caps. Lebofsky's current work is closer to home, but no less imperiled by the relentless threat of global warming and resulting erosion, in this case, of Long Island's vulnerable shoreline. There's also a personal backstory of depression and loss to incoming surf Montauk, pictured here, which humanizes the painting and makes its dark, layered imagery metaphorically powerful, extremely menacing, and emblematic as the next paradigm of environmental ideology in art. Thank you very much.